In the shadowed heart of 15th century Wallachia, a land scarred by war and treachery, one name echoed through the ages as a synonym for terror: Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. His reign was not merely a chapter of rule, but a blood-soaked saga of cruelty so extreme that it birthed legends of vampirism, inspiring the myth of Dracula himself. Picture a battlefield strewn with the bodies of his enemies, thousands impaled on towering stakes, their agonized forms a grotesque forest of death under a crimson sky. This was Vlad's signature, a warning to all who dared defy him. In a time when brutality was commonplace, Vlad's sadistic ingenuity stood apart, turning him into a figure of both dread and fascination. His story is not just one of a ruler, but of a man whose twisted tortures and unrelenting vengeance carved a permanent mark on history. As we delve into the life of Vlad the Impaler, we must first understand the turbulent world that forged him. Born in 1431 in the fortress town of Sighishuara, Transylvania, Vlad III was the son of Vlad II Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christendom against the Ottoman Empire. Wallachia, a small principality sandwiched between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, was a land of constant conflict, a battleground for power, where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal was a currency. Vlad's early life was marked by instability. His father's tenuous hold on power meant that young Vlad was often a pawn in the deadly games of politics. At the tender age of 11, he and his younger brother Radu were handed over as hostages to the Ottoman court to secure their father's allegiance, a formative experience that would plant the seeds of both hatred and cunning in Vlad's heart. This harsh upbringing in a foreign court, surrounded by enemies and subjected to the whims of his captors, shaped Vlad into a man of iron will and unrelenting ambition. The Ottomans, while providing him with a military education, also exposed him to their own brutal methods of control and punishment, methods that would later inspire his infamous penchant for impalement. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, his father faced assassination in 1447, and his older brother Mircea was buried alive by rival nobles, events that further fueled Vlad's thirst for vengeance. When he finally returned to Wallachia, it was not as a naive prince, but as a hardened warrior, ready to reclaim his birthright with blood and fire. The stage was set for a reign that would be remembered not for diplomacy or prosperity, but for a level of cruelty that shocked even the most battle-hardened of his contemporaries. The political landscape of Wallachia during Vlad's time was a viper's nest of intrigue and shifting alliances. The boyars, the powerful noble class, often undermined the ruling prince, aligning themselves with whoever offered the most power or gold, be it the Hungarians, the Ottomans, or internal rivals. Vlad's father had struggled to maintain control over these fractious nobles, and his murder was a stark reminder of their treachery. As Vlad sought to ascend to the throne, he faced not only external threats from the Ottoman Empire, which demanded tribute and submission, but also internal enemies who saw him as a threat to their influence. His determination to centralize power and crush dissent would lead to some of the most horrifying acts of violence in medieval history, acts that were as strategic as they were sadistic. Beyond the borders of Wallachia, the broader context of Europe in the mid-15th century was one of existential struggle. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottomans sent shockwaves through Christendom, and Wallachia stood as a fragile buffer state on the front lines of this clash of civilizations. Vlad's reign, which spanned 3 separate stints between 1448 and 1476, was defined by this precarious position. He was caught between paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, whom he loathed, and seeking support from the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, who was often unreliable. This constant balancing act, coupled with his personal vendettas, created a ruler who saw enemies everywhere and dealt with them in ways that would become the stuff of nightmares. As we move forward in this tale, we'll explore how Vlad's early traumas and the brutal realities of his world transformed him into a figure of legend. His methods of torture, particularly impalement, were not mere acts of cruelty but calculated tools of terror, designed to instill fear and ensure obedience. Yet, beneath the monster, there was a man driven by a desperate need to protect his land and legacy, even if it meant becoming the very evil he fought against. The story of Vlad the Impaler is a descent into darkness, a journey through a mind as tortured as the bodies he left in his wake. Let us step into the bloodied footprints of this cruelest of kings and uncover the twisted path that led to his infamous reign. As Vlad III clawed his way toward the throne of Wallachia, the air was thick with betrayal and the stench of ambition. The year was 1448, and at just 17 years old, Vlad made his first bid for power, briefly seizing the throne with Ottoman backing after his father's assassination and his brother's brutal murder. But this initial reign was a fleeting shadow, lasting mere months before he was ousted by rival forces loyal to the Hungarian crown. Wallachia was a fractured land, its noblest boyars playing a deadly game of allegiance, switching sides between Ottoman and Hungarian influences with the ease of a snake-shedding skin. Vlad, still young and untested, found himself adrift, a prince without a crown, forced into exile while his enemies reveled in their temporary triumph. Yet, this setback only steeled his resolve, forging a burning hatred for those who had stripped him of his birthright. The years that followed were a crucible of hardship and scheming for Vlad. He sought refuge in Moldavia and later in Hungary, navigating the treacherous politics of neighboring powers to gather support for his return. It was during this period of exile that Vlad honed his military skills and deepened his understanding of the ruthless tactics needed to survive in a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. In Hungary, he forged a tenuous alliance with John Hunyadi, the powerful regent and military leader who had once opposed Vlad's father but now saw the young prince as a potential weapon against the Ottoman threat. Hunyadi's support was not born of loyalty but of necessity. Wallachia was a vital buffer against the expanding Ottoman Empire, and a strong anti-Ottoman ruler was desperately needed. Vlad, with his intimate knowledge of Ottoman ways from his years as a hostage, was a calculated gamble. By 1456, after years of maneuvering and with Hungarian backing, Vlad seized the throne of Wallachia for the second time, this time with a ferocity that signaled he would not be easily displaced again. But his return was not a triumphant homecoming. It was the beginning of a reign drenched in blood and paranoia. The boyars, who had grown accustomed to manipulating weak princes for their own gain, viewed Vlad with suspicion and disdain. They whispered of his Ottoman upbringing, questioning his loyalty to Christendom, while plotting to replace him with a more pliable ruler. Vlad, acutely aware of their treachery, having witnessed how they had turned on his father, decided that he would not merely rule over these nobles, he would break them. His hatred for the boyars was personal, rooted in the memory of his father's murder and his brother's gruesome death at their hands, and it fueled a campaign of retribution that would soon become legendary. Vlad's early reign was marked by a calculated escalation of conflict, both within Wallachia and beyond its borders. Internally, he moved swiftly to consolidate power, targeting the boyars with a ruthlessness that sent shockwaves through the land. One of his first acts was to summon the most powerful nobles to a grand Easter feast in 1459 at his castle in Targovishte. What began as a celebration turned into a massacre. Hundreds of boyars and their families were arrested, and many were impaled on the spot, their bodies left as a grim warning to others. This event, known as the Easter Massacre, was not just an act of vengeance but a declaration of intent. Vlad would tolerate no dissent, no betrayal, no challenge to his authority. The surviving nobles were forced into submission, their power diminished as Vlad centralized control, replacing them with loyalists who owed everything to him. Externally, Vlad faced an even greater threat: the Ottoman Empire. which demanded tribute and subservience from Wallachia as a vassal state. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, expected Vlad to continue the payments and military support that previous rulers had provided. But Vlad, harboring a deep-seated resentment from his years as a hostage, refused to bow. In a bold act of defiance, he ceased tribute payments and began fortifying Wallachia's defenses, preparing for the inevitable retaliation. His audacity reached a peak in 1462 when Ottoman envoys arrived to demand compliance. Legend has it that Vlad ordered their turbans nailed to their heads as a message of contempt, a gruesome insult that ensured war was unavoidable. This act of provocation was a spark in a powder keg, igniting a conflict that would test the limits of Vlad's cunning and cruelty. The rising tension with the Ottomans was mirrored by growing unrest at home. While Vlad's brutal tactics had temporarily subdued the boyars, they also bred fear and resentment among the common people, who suffered under his harsh policies of taxation and forced labor to fund his military campaigns. Villages were stripped of resources, and dissenters, real or imagined, were met with horrifying punishments. Vlad's obsession with control turned Wallachia into a land of suspicion, where neighbors turned on neighbors, and the shadow of the stake loomed over every act of defiance. His reign was becoming a paradox, a desperate fight for independence from external enemies, waged at the cost of internal terror. As Vlad prepared for the inevitable Ottoman invasion, his methods grew ever more extreme, blending military strategy with psychological warfare. He understood that he could not match the Sultan's vast armies in open battle, so he turned to guerrilla tactics, scorching the earth to deny the enemy resources and using the dense forests of Wallachia as a weapon. But it was his use of terror, particularly impalement, that began to define him. Thousands of captured Ottoman soldiers and suspected spies were subjected to this agonizing death, their bodies displayed along roads as a macabre deterrent. Vlad's reputation as a monster was spreading, whispered in fear by his enemies and with uneasy awe by his allies. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would push Vlad to the brink. With the boyars cowed but resentful, the people trembling under his iron fist, and the might of the Ottoman Empire bearing down on Wallachia, Vlad stood at the crossroads of history. His reign, built on blood and fear, was about to face its greatest test, a test that would reveal the full extent of his twisted genius and unrelenting cruelty. With the specter of Ottoman invasion looming over Wallachia in the early 1460s, Vlad III, now firmly entrenched as prince, transformed his small principality into a fortress of fear. His defiance of Sultan Mehmed II had set the stage for a brutal showdown, but Vlad knew that his outnumbered forces could not face the Ottoman juggernaut head-on. Instead, he embraced a strategy of terror and attrition, turning every inch of Wallachian soil into a weapon against his enemies. His reign, already marked by the Easter massacre of the boyars, took on an even darker hue as he unleashed a campaign of psychological warfare that would sear his name into the annals of history. The Impaler was no longer just a ruler. He was becoming a living nightmare, a specter of cruelty whose very name struck dread into the hearts of friend and foe alike. Vlad's tactics against the impending Ottoman advance were as ingenious as they were horrifying. In 1462, as Mehmed II prepared to march on Wallachia with an army said to number over 100,000 men, Vlad adopted a scorched earth policy to starve the invaders of resources. He ordered villages along the enemy's path to be burned, wells poisoned, and livestock slaughtered, leaving nothing but desolation in his wake. His guerrilla fighters, striking from the dense forests and rugged terrain, harassed the Ottoman forces with hit-and-run attacks, whittling down their morale. But it was the sight that awaited the Sultan's army near the capital of Targovishte that would become the stuff of legend, a forest of 20,000 impaled bodies, a grotesque tableau of Turkish soldiers and civilians alike, their rotting forms skewered on towering stakes as far as the eye could see. This Forest of the Impaled was not just a display of brutality. It was a calculated message, designed to shatter the enemy's will to fight. The psychological impact of this horrific spectacle was profound. Mehmed II, a conqueror who had seen countless atrocities in his campaign to take Constantinople, was reportedly so shaken by the sight that he ordered a retreat, unable to stomach the thought of facing the mind behind such carnage. Vlad's gambit had worked, at least temporarily. The Ottoman invasion faltered, buying Wallachia a fleeting reprieve. But this victory came at a steep cost. The same terror that repelled his enemies also alienated his own people, who bore the brunt of his ruthless policies. Peasants, already suffering from the destruction of their homes and livelihoods, whispered of their prince as a devil incarnate, a man who seemed to revel in suffering as much as he did in survival. Vlad's rule was becoming a double-edged sword, cutting down his adversaries while carving deep wounds into the soul of Wallachia itself. Within his borders, Vlad's obsession with control only intensified. The boyars who had survived his earlier purges lived in constant fear, their every move scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Vlad's network of spies and informants permeated every level of society, turning neighbor against neighbor in a climate of paranoia. Those suspected of treason or even minor dissent faced punishments that went beyond mere execution. Impalement, his signature method, was a slow and agonizing death, often taking days as the victim writhed in torment, their cries a public warning to others. But Vlad's cruelty was not limited to this one act. Historical accounts speak of boiling, skinning, and dismemberment as tools in his arsenal, each punishment tailored to maximize fear. A merchant who dared to cheat in the marketplace might find his hands severed, while a disloyal soldier could be buried alive, their fate a grim lesson in obedience. Vlad's harshness extended even to the most vulnerable. Stories from the time, though sometimes exaggerated by his enemies, tell of entire villages being massacred for failing to meet his demands for tribute or labor. Women and children were not spared. In one chilling account, he ordered the impalement of mothers alongside their infants, a display of savagery meant to crush any thought of rebellion. These acts were not random outbursts of rage, but part of a deliberate strategy to centralize power and eliminate any threat to his rule. Vlad believed that only through absolute terror could he forge a Wallachia strong enough to withstand its enemies, both internal and external. Yet, as the bodies piled up, so too did the whispers of discontent, seeds of unrest that would one day grow into his undoing. The international perception of Vlad was also shifting. While his brutal tactics earned him a grudging respect from some European leaders as a bulwark against the Ottoman threat, others began to see him as a liability, a ruler whose excesses could destabilize the fragile balance of power in the region. In Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus, who had once supported Vlad, grew wary of his allies' methods, especially as reports of his atrocities reached the courts of Europe. Pamphlets and woodcuts depicting Vlad's tortures began to circulate, often embellished for dramatic effect, painting him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. These early forms of propaganda, while not entirely accurate, cemented his reputation as a monster, a precursor to the Dracula myth that would emerge centuries later. Vlad was becoming a figure larger than life, a symbol of cruelty that overshadowed his strategic mind. As the immediate threat of Ottoman invasion receded, Vlad's focus turned inward once more, his paranoia driving him to ever greater extremes. Every shadow held a potential traitor, every whisper a plot against him. He fortified his castles, particularly the remote Poenari Castle perched high in the Carpathian Mountains, a stronghold built with the forced labor of captured enemies and disloyal nobles, many of whom perished in the grueling process. This fortress became a physical manifestation of his isolation, a place where he could retreat from a world that seemed bent on his destruction. But even here, surrounded by stone walls and loyal guards, Vlad could not escape the consequences of his reign. The tension in Wallachia was reaching a breaking point. While Vlad had momentarily repelled the Ottomans, he had also sown the seeds of his own downfall. His people, exhausted by war and terror, yearned for relief, while his surviving enemies, both within and without, waited for an opportunity to strike. The stage was set for a dramatic turn, a moment that would test the limits of Vlad's power and reveal the true cost of his twisted tortures. By the mid-1460s, Vlad III's reign over Wallachia had become a fragile edifice, built on a foundation of fear but crumbling under the weight of his own excesses. The Forest of the Impaled had bought him a temporary victory against the Ottoman forces in 1462, but it had also deepened the enmity of Sultan Mehmed II, who now saw Vlad not just as a rebellious vassal but as a personal affront to his authority. At home, the terror that had once silenced dissent was breeding a quiet, simmering hatred among the people and the remaining boyars, who waited for any crack in Vlad's iron grip to strike. The prince who had once seemed invincible was now a man besieged on all fronts, his brutal methods turning allies into enemies, and his paranoia isolating him from even his most loyal supporters. The descent of Vlad the Impaler had begun, and it would be as bloody and tragic as his rise. The turning point came in late 1462, when Vlad's tenuous alliance with Hungary, his primary source of external support, began to unravel. King Matthias Corvinus, under pressure from the Pope and other European powers to unite Christendom against the Ottoman threat, grew increasingly uneasy with Vlad's savage reputation. Reports of his atrocities, amplified by sensationalized accounts circulating through Europe, painted him as a liability rather than an asset. When Vlad sought Hungarian aid for another campaign against the Ottomans, Matthias hesitated, wary of associating too closely with a ruler whose name was becoming synonymous with barbarism. Worse still, Vlad's enemies within Wallachia, including surviving boyars and rival claimants to the throne, began to whisper in the ears of foreign courts, offering themselves as more palatable alternatives. The ground beneath Vlad was shifting, and he could feel the noose tightening. The decisive blow came when Matthias Corvinus, influenced by these intrigues and seeking to placate the Ottomans for a temporary peace, turned against Vlad. In November 1462, under the pretext of a diplomatic meeting, Vlad was lured to the Hungarian border, where he was arrested on charges of treason and collusion, with the Ottoman accusations given his fierce resistance to them. The betrayal stung deeply. Vlad, who had trusted few in his life, saw this as yet another proof that mercy and alliance were weaknesses he could ill afford. He was dragged in chains to Buda, the Hungarian capital, and imprisoned in the fortress of Visegrad, a cold, stone prison overlooking the Danube. The man who had once impaled thousands now found himself stripped of power, locked away in a cell, his fate uncertain as his enemies reveled in his downfall. Vlad's imprisonment, which lasted for over a decade from 1462 to around 1474, was a period of profound suffering, though not in the physical tortures he had inflicted on others. Historical records of this time are sparse, but it is believed he was kept in relative isolation, his once sharp mind left to fester in the confines of his cell. The psychological toll must have been immense. Vlad, a man of action and unrelenting will, was reduced to a prisoner, powerless to influence the world beyond his bars. Wallachia, meanwhile, fell into the hands of his younger brother Radu the Handsome, who had long been a favorite of the Ottomans and now ruled as their puppet. Radu's reign was a deliberate contrast to Vlad's, marked by diplomacy and submission rather than defiance, a bitter pill for Vlad to swallow as he languished in captivity, knowing his land was bending the knee to the very empire he had fought so fiercely. The conditions of Vlad's confinement, while not as gruesome as the fates he had dealt to others, were far from comfortable. He was held as a political prisoner, subject to the whims of Hungarian politics, his status fluctuating with the shifting alliances of the time. At times, he was treated with a degree of respect due to his former position and potential usefulness against the Ottomans. At others, he was little more than a forgotten relic, a dangerous beast caged for the safety of all. Legends suggest that even in prison, Vlad's cruelty manifested in small, chilling way. Stories tell of him impaling mice and birds with tiny stakes fashioned from wood scraps, a macabre pastime that hinted at the darkness still burning within him. Whether true or not, these tales reflect the enduring image of Vlad as a man consumed by violence, unable to escape his own nature even in chains. Back in Wallachia, the absence of Vlad did not bring peace, but rather a different kind of turmoil. Radu's pro-Ottoman policies alienated many, and the land remained a battleground for influence between Hungary and the Sultan's forces. Vlad's brutal legacy lingered in the minds of the people, some of whom, despite their fear of him, began to see his reign as a time of strength against foreign domination. This undercurrent of nostalgia for his rule, combined with growing discontent under Radu, kept Vlad's name alive, a specter of potential return that haunted his enemies. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus eventually began to reconsider Vlad's imprisonment, recognizing that a fierce anti-Ottoman warrior might still have a role to play in the endless struggle against Mehmed II's empire. As the years dragged on, Vlad's spirit, though battered, refused to break entirely. His imprisonment was a crucible, refining his hatred and sharpening his resolve for vengeance. When the opportunity for release finally came, it would not be a moment of redemption, but a prelude to further bloodshed. The Impaler, though diminished, was far from finished, and the world would soon tremble once more under the shadow of his stakes. After over a decade of imprisonment in Hungary, Vlad III emerged from the shadows of Visegrad in 1474, a man hardened by years of confinement, but still burning with the same unrelenting fire that had defined his earlier reigns. King Matthias Corvinus, facing renewed Ottoman aggression and internal unrest in Wallachia under the rule of Vlad's brother Radu and subsequent puppet princes, saw in Vlad a weapon too potent to remain caged. Released under the condition of converting to Catholicism and pledging loyalty to Hungary, Vlad was a shadow of his former self in power but not in spirit. His return to Wallachia in 1476, for his third and final stint as prince, was not a triumphant restoration but a desperate, bloody gasp of a man determined to reclaim his legacy, no matter the cost. The stage was set for a climax as brutal and tragic as the life he had led, a final chapter that would cement his name in infamy. Vlad's third reign began with a swift and violent campaign to retake the throne. With Hungarian support and a small but loyal force, he ousted the reigning prince, Basarab Lyotu, a pro-Ottoman ruler who had little love among the Wallachian people. In November 1476, Vlad entered Targovishte once more as prince, his return greeted not with cheers but with a wary silence. The people remembered the forests of stakes, the screams of the impaled, and the unrelenting terror of his rule. Yet, some saw in him a necessary evil, a bulwark against the Ottoman yoke that had tightened in his absence. Vlad wasted no time in reasserting his authority, launching a purge of disloyal boyars and suspected traitors with the same ruthless efficiency that had marked his earlier years. Bodies once again lined the roads, a grim reminder that the Impaler had not softened in captivity. But Vlad's grip on power was more tenuous than ever. The Hungarian forces that had backed his return soon withdrew, leaving him with a depleted army and a land ravaged by years of conflict and mismanagement. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, was quick to respond to this renewed defiance, dispatching an army to crush Vlad once and for all. At the same time, internal enemies boyars who had survived his purges and rival claimants, backed by foreign powers, plotted his downfall. Sensing his weakened state, Vlad, ever the strategist, resorted to the guerrilla tactics that had once repelled invaders, striking from the forests and mountains, impaling captured soldiers to sow fear. But the odds were insurmountable. His forces were outnumbered, his resources depleted, and his people too weary to endure another reign of terror. The final confrontation came in late December 1476 or early January 1477, though the exact date and circumstances remain shrouded in mystery and legend. Historical accounts differ, but most agree that Vlad met his end in a skirmish near Bucharest, ambushed by a combined force of Ottoman troops and Wallachian traders eager to see him dead. One chilling narrative suggests he was betrayed by his own men, cut down in the midst of battle as he fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast. Another account, steeped in the macabre, claims that Vlad disguised himself as a Turkish soldier to infiltrate the enemy lines, only to be recognized and slaughtered by his own confused troops. Whatever the truth, the end was gruesome. Vlad's body was reportedly decapitated, his head sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake, a bitter irony for the man who had made impalement his signature. The image of Vlad's severed head, paraded as proof of his demise, was a fittingly grim capstone to a life defined by violence. His death was not a quiet passing but a brutal, public spectacle, mirroring the countless deaths he had orchestrated. Some sources claim the Sultan preserved Vlad's head in honey to prolong its display, a final humiliation for a ruler who had defied him so fiercely. Back in Wallachia, his body, or what remained of it, was said to have been buried at the Snagov Monastery, a remote island sanctuary he had once patronized. Yet, even this final resting place is uncertain. Later excavations found no definitive trace of him, fueling legends that the Impaler's spirit could not be so easily confined to the grave. Vlad's death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his story. In the immediate aftermath, Wallachia fell deeper into Ottoman control, with Basarab Leota and other puppet rulers resuming power under the Sultan's shadow. The people who had lived under Vlad's iron fist were left to grapple with a complex legacy. Some mourned the loss of a fierce defender of their independence, while others cursed the memory of a tyrant whose cruelty had scarred their land. His final reign, though brief, was a microcosm of his life, a desperate struggle for control, marked by bloodshed and betrayal, ending in a violent, lonely demise. As the dust settled over Wallachia, the echoes of Vlad's final stand reverberated through history. His death was not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of a myth in the making. A ruler whose twisted tortures and unrelenting will had defied the norms of even a brutal age. The Impaler was gone, but the shadow he cast would grow longer with time, morphing into tales of darkness that would outlive the truth of his tragic end. With Vlad III's brutal death in the winter of 1476–1477, Wallachia was left a fractured land, its soil soaked with the blood of countless victims, and its people weary from decades of strife. The immediate aftermath of his demise saw a swift return to Ottoman dominance, as Sultan Mehmed II reasserted control through puppet rulers like Basarab Leota, who resumed power with little resistance. Vlad's headless body, rumored to be interred at Snagov Monastery, became a ghostly footnote in a land eager to forget the terror of his reign. Yet even in death, Vlad could not be easily erased. His absence left a void that neither his successors nor his enemies could fully fill. The boyars, many of whom had conspired against him, regained some influence, but Wallachia's position as a vassal state under Ottoman rule deepened, a bitter irony for a man who had fought so fiercely for independence. The dream of a strong, autonomous Wallachia faded, replaced by a reality of submission and tribute, a stark contrast to the fiery defiance Vlad had embodied. In the years following his death, Vlad's name lingered in hushed tones among the Wallachian people. For some, he remained a symbol of resistance, a prince who, despite his cruelty, had stood against the might of the Ottoman Empire when few others dared. Peasants whispered of his harsh but effective justice, recalling tales of how he had punished dishonesty and disloyalty with an iron hand, ensuring order in a lawless time. Others, however, could not forgive the horrors he inflicted: the forests of impaled bodies, the massacres of entire villages, the unrelenting fear that had gripped their lives. His reign became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of absolute power wielded without mercy. In Wallachia, memory of Vlad was a divided one, split between grudging respect and deep-seated trauma, a duality that mirrored the man himself. Beyond Wallachia's borders, Vlad's story took on a life of its own, shaped by the propaganda and sensationalism of the time. In the courts of Europe, particularly in Germany and Hungary, his atrocities were chronicled in pamphlets and woodcuts, often exaggerated to paint him as a bloodthirsty monster. These early accounts, printed in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, depicted him feasting among the impaled, reveling in torture with a sadistic glee that bordered on the supernatural. While some of these stories were rooted in truth, others were fabrications meant to demonize him, serving the political agendas of his enemies, particularly the Hungarian crown, which sought to justify his imprisonment and downfall. This dark caricature of Vlad, as a tyrant beyond redemption, laid the groundwork for a legend that would evolve over centuries, far outstripping the historical reality of his complex life. The most enduring transformation of Vlad's legacy came centuries later, when his name became inextricably linked to the myth of the vampire. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula, drawing inspiration from Vlad's nickname, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, derived from his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon, and the gruesome tales of his cruelty. While Stoker's novel took significant liberties, blending historical fragments with Gothic fiction, it immortalized Vlad as the archetypal bloodsucker, a creature of darkness whose thirst for blood echoed the real-life horrors of impalement. This literary reinvention turned Vlad from a medieval ruler into a cultural icon, a symbol of terror that persists in modern media, from films to novels, often overshadowing the geopolitical and personal struggles that defined his actual existence. The Impaler, once a man of flesh and blood, became a shadow that haunts the imagination of the world. Vlad's legacy also raises questions about the nature of power and morality in times of crisis. In an era when brutality was a common tool of governance, Vlad stood out not just for the scale of his violence but for its calculated, psychological impact. His use of terror as a weapon against both enemies and his own people challenges us to consider where the line between protector and tyrant lies. Was he a necessary evil, a man shaped by a brutal world to defend his land at any cost? Or was he a monster whose personal vendettas and paranoia drove him to unspeakable acts? Historians still debate his motivations, sifting through biased accounts and scarce records to uncover the truth beneath the myth. What remains clear is that Vlad's story is not one of simple villainy, but of a deeply flawed human caught in the crucible of history. As we close this tale of blood and stakes, Vlad the Impaler's shadow lingers, a reminder of the extremes to which desperation and ambition can drive a soul. His life, marked by betrayal, vengeance, and unrelenting cruelty, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of survival in a world without mercy. How do we remember a man whose name evokes both horror and fascination, a ruler who defied empires yet tortured his own? If this story has stirred something in you, whether it's revulsion, curiosity, or a question about the nature of power, share your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation alive, exploring the dark corners of history where figures like Vlad continue to challenge our understanding of humanity itself.